All righty. The clock on the pew, somebody actually reset. It actually says 9:01. It's not 10 o'clock. So we'll go ahead and get ready to get started. And we'll start with prayer list. Of course, Dan Medeiros back in the hospital. He's back at Christian Health. Okay, bulletin ahead, he was back in the hospital, so he's back at Christian Health. Okay. Trying to remember, I just scanned it a second ago. Debbie Scott continuing to recover. Bob Ellis, is he gone to rehab or is he still in the hospital? Okay. And Carla, there was one more on there. Vicki Champion having heart issues, had to have a stent. Cecilia had her surgery this week. She is recovering from her back surgery. Anybody else? A lot of people will be on the road today. If they're not already on the road, there will be a lot of people traveling today, headed back. A lot of college students headed back after some holiday home time. So a lot of people are going to be on the highways and byways today. Anybody else? Everybody quiet this morning. Everybody still got turkey and dressing in the fridge, huh? All right, if we don't have anything else, Brother Pete, would you start us with a prayer? Thank you, sir. So we are continuing on with our look at the Gospel of Mark to the point. We will either finish it today or next week, and then we will start Christian characteristics. We'll look at the characteristics that should be a part of a Christian life, and we'll start into that. Like I said, either might be pushing it to finish today, but we should wrap it up next week for sure. So we are in chapter 14, beginning of verse 43. And this has come, we've gotten through last week where Jesus went to the garden to pray, where he asked if there was any way out, that he could get out of this. But he ultimately said, what? Father, it's your will, not mine. So we get in here to beginning of verse 43. It said, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, suddenly arrived. With him was a mob with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. His betrayer had given them a signal. The one I kiss, he said, he's the one. Arrest him and take him away under guard. So when he came, immediately he went up to Jesus and said, Rabbi, and kissed him. They took hold of him and arrested him. One of those who stood by drew his sword, struck the high priest's servant, and cut off his ear. Jesus said to them, have you come out with swords and clubs as if I were a criminal to capture me? Every day I was among you teaching in the temple, and you didn't arrest me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. Then they all deserted him and ran away. Now a certain young man wearing nothing but a linen cloth was following him. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth behind and ran away naked. So now we see the arrest of Jesus. At the end of that passage there, ever wonder why Mark included that part? Because who generally is believed is the one who took off and ran away? A lot of people believe it's Mark. So why, if you're writing that down, would you say, by the way, I took off and fled, and I ran off with my clothes hanging in their hands? But for some reason, it's included. Unless he just wanted it to be known that, yeah, I did it too. That Mark was willing to even run away naked just to get away from the situation. So, yes? Just that's what he was wearing, his linen cloth. And that's the attire that they would have been wearing would have been linen and very little under. And so he just dropped his linen and took off. In their hand, they were sort of, I guess they were reaching out to grab him, and he said, see ya. But then he just dropped it and took off. No, I don't believe so. I believe he just noted, I believe Mark, this is just me, I believe he writes that down just to admit to the fact that he took off and that he was willing to even shed his clothes to get away from that situation. He's not being prideful and not saying everybody ran off but me. I think he may be even admitting here that he was willing to run off. So as they come to arrest Jesus, he tells them, hey, you guys could have taken me any time. Was Jesus hiding from them? He was in the temple, he was teaching, and they come out here, and of course, now what is this? This is what, middle of the night we're talking about here too. This all takes place under the cover of what? Darkness. They don't want the people to see, they don't want the people to be aware. What we talked about last week, they were trying to avoid a what? A riot. They didn't want a disturbance, so we're going to do this off the cuff under darkness here. And Jesus says, you could have come and got me at any time. It's sort of like, what's the real deal here? Why are you coming now? Why are you coming with swords and clubs? Another thing there's no indication that Jesus was going to fight. There was no indication that Jesus was going to resort to some kind of violent retaliation. They come with swords and clubs, just like they would be to what Jesus says, to take a criminal. You're treating me just like a criminal. And we're going to see that over the next several hours, that's simply what they do. They treat him like any common criminal. Now, this is not going to be a fight. There is no fight, even though we see the example of one of those with Jesus pulls out a sword and swings it. But it's not going to be a fight. Jesus says this is so scriptures could be fulfilled. The disciples had just said an hour earlier that they would not abandon Jesus. But what happens when they arrest Jesus? Are they standing there saying, this is wrong? You shouldn't be doing this. We're going to go protest before whatever place you're taking him. We're going to go stand up for him. Or what do? Jesus has already told them what happened, what was going to happen. And they all said, no, we're not going to do it. They all take off. They all take off. Their human fears that they're going to be arrested too hits, and they flee. They flee. So now Jesus is in custody. This was prophesied, and we talked about it last week from Zechariah. So now Jesus is in custody, and we're going to see denied. What happens? We talked about last week and the last 2 weeks about Judas and the betrayal and the setup and what motives Judas may have had. Now we're going to talk about the denial. Let's go on to verse 53. Mark 14, verse 53. It says, then they led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes assembled. Peter followed him at a distance right into the high priest's courtyard. He was sitting with the servants, warming himself by the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they could not find any. For many were giving false testimony against him, and the testimonies did not agree. Some stood up and gave false testimony against him, stating, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made by hands.' Yet their testimony did not agree even on this." Then the high priest stood up before them all and questioned Jesus. "Don't you have an answer to what these men are testifying against you?" But he kept silent and did not answer. Again the high priest questioned him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What is your decision?" They all condemned him as deserving death. Then some began to spit on him, to blindfold him, and to beat him, saying, "Prophesy." The temple servants also took him and slapped him. So now we begin the process of what we would call a sham trial. And lots of things go on here to point out to how big a sham it was. Note Jesus' response there to the high priest, and we talked about that when we were looking at Mark 13, and talked about how necessarily seeing the Son of Man in the clouds was not necessarily a symbol or a statement about his return. He tells the high priest here, "You're going to see the Son of Man in the clouds." That's not talking about the second coming, and we talked about the figurative language that really may have been, that is used oftentimes in that statement. So now he is rejected by the religious leaders, rejected. This is roughly this is where the high priest's house today, they believe, would have been. This kind of building would have been the kind of building that the high priest would have lived in. And it would have been likely an area like where this trial is taking place. And then down in an area like this, these are all some archaeological pictures of a place that people believe may have been where this actually took place. So the chief priests and the Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus. And we talked several times earlier about their motives. Did they care if it was true? Did they really care if it was true at this point? No. They wanted it to what? Stick. They wanted to get enough evidence. If you watch Law and Order, a preponderance of the evidence, they wanted enough to convict here. But they don't care if it's accurate. They just want it to be to accomplish their task. So they're looking for evidence against Jesus. They don't have any evidence, do they? At this point, they don't have anything. They have convened this trial because they're looking for a reason. They don't have any real evidence to put him to death. They're just trying to find something. Even the false testimony that are being generated does not agree with itself. They've got people coming in agreeing to make false testimony, but here's the problem. This person's false testimony does not agree with this person's false testimony. You're trying to merge one lie with another lie, and guess what? It doesn't fit. So even this, at this point in this sham of a trial, this person says this against Jesus, this person says this, but they're contradicting each other. And it doesn't fit. They can't get anything that really sticks together at this point. Bearing false witness, here's what's interesting about this. These are men, the Sanhedrin, the scribes, the Pharisees, all supposed to be people of the law, but what's the problem with bearing false witness? Bearing false witness is a violation of God's law. Today in our court system, if you lie in court, we call it what? Perjury. And you can go to jail for perjury. So here are those who are supposed to be upholding the law, and they are encouraging people to violate God's law. But they can't get them to do it consistently and in agreement. But bearing false witness is against God's law. But again, we talk about they don't care. They just want Jesus to go away because he's a threat to their lifestyle, to their status. But Jesus refuses to answer. They're laying out all these charges. They're saying, he said this, he said this. What would most of us do in this situation? Most of us would be standing saying, no, I didn't. You're a liar. You're not telling the truth. Most of us would have been stomping our foot and say, no, no, no. I didn't do it. Jesus does what here? Says absolutely nothing. He doesn't answer the charges. Why? One reason is they're not worth answering. The lies are so obvious, there's nothing he can say. There's nothing he can say that's going to diffuse what they're trying to do. And Jesus knows this. He knows that there is no answer to what they're accusing him of that he can say that's going to suit them, because they're not looking for the truth. They're looking for a way to trap him. Truth is irrelevant to them at this situation. So Jesus doesn't answer. He will not deny himself, but he accepts the title. When he's asked if he is the one, what does he say? Verse 61, but he kept silent and did not answer. Again, the high priest questioned him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? Jesus answers with two words. What's he say? I am. He doesn't say this time, you say so. He doesn't, this is a straightforward, yes, I am. He says, I am. He accepts the title. And then he says, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. The high priest is asking, he says, I'm him. And he says, you will see. Jesus directly proclaims judgment here against the leaders and the nation of Israel. Jesus declares himself to be the Messiah and God himself. Here is the penultimate moment of this trial. They ask Jesus if he's the Messiah. He says, I am. And he says, you will see. And to the religious leaders, they now think what? Case closed. Yeah, Barbara just said it. Because now they believe Jesus has done what? He's blasphemed. By saying that he is God, they now believe they have him. By saying he is the Messiah, they believe they have the case closed. They've got all they need. And they think they've won. They think they've got it. Because what's the penalty for blasphemy? Death. So they think they've got the case closed. Let's go on and see what happens as we get on to verse beginning where we left off. At verse 66. But now they think they've got it. Now while Peter was in the courtyard below, one of the high priest's maidservants came. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, You also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth. But he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about. Then he went out to the entryway, and a rooster crowed. When the maidservant saw him again, she began to tell those standing nearby, This man is one of them. But again he denied it. After a little while, those standing there said to Peter again, You certainly are one of them, since you are also a Galilean. Then he started to curse and swear, I don't know this man you're talking about. Immediately a rooster crowed a second time, and Peter remembered what Jesus had spoken the word to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. So while the trial is going on, Peter's out in the courtyard. He's hanging out, sort of at a distance, and he's trying to keep his eye on what's going on. But he does what he said he would never do. He does what Jesus told him he was going to do, and Peter said still he would not do it. Peter has returned to the proximity of Jesus. He may have scattered during the arrest, but he comes back and he's trying to keep an eye on things. Hanging out there in what our terminology would be in the ballpark. Trying to keep an eye and see what's developing. But here we have a servant girl. Servant girl comes up to Peter and says, "Aren't you one of them?" Peter's response is, "I got no clue. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just, you could get the feeling that Peter's sort of saying there going, I just want to come see what was happening. I just wanted to, people driving down the highway like the rubber-necked wreck scenes. Peter may have tried to pretend, I was just walking by and I heard all this commotion. I just want to see what's happening. But Peter's response is, I got no clue what you're talking about. What happens? Rooster crows. First time. You would have thought maybe that would have jarred Peter a little bit, but maybe not. She says it again. You ever seen, I think it was a W.C. Fields movie, and there's a kid sort of hanging around annoying him, and he does, "Go away, kid, you bother me." You can sort of see this servant girl just sort of trailing Peter and going, pointing to other people, he's him. He's one of them. He's one of them. You can sort of imagine Peter going, "Go away from me, get away." You can sort of imagine that scene happening, but she says it again. He is one of them. Peter's reply is, I am not one of them. No, not me. You don't know what you're talking about. But he denies it again. Then the crowd begins to say it. You can probably imagine Peter there going, "Oh, this little girl, go away. She's going to get them stirred up. They're going to eventually sniff around and figure out who I am." But now the crowd's beginning to pick up on it, and they're going, "Oh, yeah, he was one of them. I remember." And you can hear them, people saying, "I think I saw him with them. I think he's one of them." Yeah. And finally, Peter just loses it. Peter goes off the deep end. It says he curses. Now, let's talk here. What we're not talking about is language that we would call four-letter words or things like that. Cursing here more than likely means that Peter was saying, by the love of whatever, or by my ancestors, or by your ancestors, leave me alone. This is not the case. He is laying out curses. He's swearing by everything he can swear by. I don't know him. I'm not with him. I got no clue. You can sort of see Peter looking about like this right now. I've told you, I told you, I told you. What else do you want me to tell you? I'm not with him. And then what happens? As Peter has denied him a third time, the rooster crows. And by what Mark writes down here, obviously, Peter heard this rooster. The first one he probably heard, for some reason it didn't affect him, but he hears this one, and what happens? He broke down and wept. Imagine the thought that comes over Peter. Peter had just told the Lord, I would never. We get the feeling from everything that's written about Peter in the Gospels, he was a sort of boisterous, pompous, we'd call him probably a little arrogant, believes in himself a lot. And he had told Jesus, I'm not gonna, I would never. And Jesus looked him in the eyes and said, before the rooster crows twice, you'll have done it 3 times. He didn't deny him just once. He didn't deny him just twice. he denied him 3 times in front of all those people. Imagine the rush of thoughts in Peter's mind when he hears in the distance that rooster crow. And to realize the thoughts he must have had the moment he realizes, I did it. Have you ever imagined yourself in a situation where you thought, I would never do that, and then you end up doing it? And then the thoughts that come over you when you realize, I can't believe I did that. And this is after Peter said, I would never. The matter for us to consider is, do we only claim to be a follower of Jesus when it's convenient or beneficial for us to do so? It was not convenient or beneficial for Peter at this moment, was it? What would have likely happened if he'd have said, yep, I'm with him till the very end? Would they not have likely arrested Peter at that moment? But do we only claim to be a follower when it's convenient for us or beneficial for us? Peter, when it was beneficial for him to claim he didn't know him, did it. So what is our status when we find ourselves in a similar situation? One writer, as I was looking through this, had this quote, there is no such thing as a hidden disciple. There is no such thing as a hidden disciple. That means if we're going to be Christians, others should see it, others should know it, others should recognize it. But there is no such thing as a hidden disciple. Matthew 5:16 says, in the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Let your light shine. The old children's song, hide it under what? A bushel. No. I'm going to let it shine. There is no such thing as a hidden disciple. The matter for us to consider is, do we only claim to be a follower of Jesus when it's convenient or beneficial for us to do so? Something we all, myself included, need to ponder is, we can't hide it, and it should not be when it's convenient for us. So now we move on. The religious leaders have what they want. They don't have to worry about the lies, because from their viewpoint, Jesus has now committed blasphemy by saying he is the Messiah. He is God. So now we move on to chapter 15, and we begin at verse 1 as we begin into the trials before Pilate. Now, as soon as it was morning, having held a meeting with the elders, scribes, and the whole Sanhedrin, the chief priests tied Jesus up and led him away, handing him over to Pilate. So Pilate asked him, are you the king of the Jews? He answered him, you say so. And the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate questioned him again, aren't you going to answer? Look how many things they are accusing you of. But Jesus still did not answer, and so Pilate was amazed. At the festival, Pilate used to release for the people a prisoner whom they requested. There was one named Barabbas who was in prison with rebels who had committed murder during the rebellion. The crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do for them as was his custom. Pilate answered them, do you want me to release the king of the Jews for you? For he knew it was because of envy that the chief priest had handed him over. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd so he would release Barabbas to them instead. Pilate asked them again, then what do you want me to do with the one you call king of the Jews? Again they shouted, crucify him. Pilate said to them, why? What has he done wrong? But they shouted all the more, crucify him. Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. After having Jesus flogged, he handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers led him away into the palace, that is the governor's residence, and called the whole company together. They dressed him in a purple robe, twisted together a crown of thorns, and put it on him. And they began to salute him, hail, King of the Jews. They were hitting him on the head with a stick and spitting on him. Getting down on their knees, they were paying him homage. After they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple robe and put his clothes back on him. So now we see Jesus before Pilate in Pilate's trial. So, here we've gone through the sham of a trial in front of the religious leaders, and now they head off to Pilate. Why do they have to go to Pilate here? Why can't they just kill Jesus? They didn't have the authority, because who was the only person in the Roman rule that could kill anybody? The Roman government was the only person who could execute somebody, was it not? So the Jewish religious leaders couldn't do this. They had to get a little help. So now they have to go to Pilate and convince Pilate that Jesus has done things worthy of death. Archaeology experts believe this is somewhat a possible place, location, or the type of setting where this took place in this kind of area. In a chamber, in this courtyard. So it gives you a little bit of a way to visualize all of this taking place and the scenery and the setting of which it was happening. Note, here, Mark only mentions one appearance before Pilate and does not mention the appearance before Herod. Why? Because what Mark is mentioning here is not Jesus' first appearance before Pilate, is it? What does Pilate do the first time they bring Jesus to him? Says, I don't want to deal with this. He passes it up to Herod. And then what does Herod do after he has spent some time with Jesus? He turns around and says, back in your lap. Nobody wants to deal with this. They're all thinking about the turmoil and the disruption this could cause, and that means Rome's going to come down. But I wonder, why? Mark, my thought is, nothing happens in the first meeting with Pilate. Nothing happens really in the meeting with Herod. Mark is trying to get to the point to his audience of who Jesus is and what happens. And really, if you look at those two instances, is there anything in the first appearance before Pilate and the appearance before Herod that affects the story that Mark's trying to tell? So, who knows? We just know that Mark gets to the point and gets into the main part of what happens before Pilate. Now, the religious leaders have no real reason to put Jesus to death. They're claiming blasphemy, but they don't have any real reason. He's not a criminal. He's not proclaiming to be a leader that's going to overthrow Rome. They have no real reason to put Jesus to death. And in fact, Mark tells us that Pilate knows what's going on, doesn't he? He tells us Pilate is doing this, he recognizes this is all because of what? In the verses we just read, it says Pilate knows this is all because of envy. Pilate knows this is going on. He's trying to get this out of his lap. Mark also doesn't have in his gospel about where Pilate's advised by his lady friend, don't deal with this. Don't have anything to do with this. But the religious leaders have no real reason. In Luke, we see the false accusations of Jesus opposing paying taxes, and they say he asserts himself to be a king. Jesus never said anything about not paying taxes, did he? What did he say? Render unto God what is God's, and render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And he never asserted himself to be an earthly king. So again, as we see here, as they appear before Pilate, truth is optional. They don't care. Never mind that false testimony is against God's law. They don't care. Pilate asked Jesus if he's going to defend himself against these charges. And again, Jesus doesn't say much. And again, you got to figure it's because there's nothing that Jesus is going to say here that's going to change anybody's mind. Pilate's looking for an out. But the religious leaders and the Roman government here are connected pretty tightly. But Pilate asked Jesus, are you going to defend yourself or are you going to stand up and fight? Most of us would have been saying, I'm not guilty. I told those guys before I didn't do it. I'm not guilty. I'm not that. But Jesus says nothing in his defense. Question. What if Jesus had defended himself against the accusations? Ever wondered? What if he says to Pilate, they're lying? What happens? But he doesn't. But what if Jesus had said, nope, they're not telling the truth. I told them to pay the taxes to you, what belongs to you. Pay to God what belongs to God. And what happens if he just said no? My guess is they more vehemently find more lies, and this is a train that's not going to stop now. One writer said, Jesus remained silent because his accusers didn't deserve the time of day. From the very beginning of his ministry, he was falsely accused because the things he said infuriated the religious leaders of the day. Goes on to say, as he stood before Pilate with charges brought against him, he didn't need to respond. They didn't deserve a response. His life spoke for itself. At the end of the day, the silence of the Lord is a good reminder of the ugliness of his trial. The whole thing was a sham not worthy of divine commentary. There was nothing he could say. Pilate gives them a chance to get out of this. You get the feeling here that Pilate really doesn't want to be responsible for this execution. So Pilate thinks, well, I'll give them a chance. I'll give them something that there's no way they can accept. He's thinking, here's a big criminal like Barabbas. I'm going to offer to release him or Jesus. And they have to take Jesus because Jesus is nowhere near the evil man that Barabbas is. Pilate's somewhere thinking, hey, this is going to get this resolved. But what happens? The religious leaders have now stirred up the crowd. Let's get Barabbas. We want Barabbas. Matthew 27:19, this is what I was talking about. In Matthew it says, while Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message. Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him. Pilate's wife is saying, no, stay away from this. Pilate's trying to get out of this. He's offering Barabbas, a bad person, a criminal. He's trying to get out of this every which way he can. And his wife's telling him, don't have anything to do with it. Pilate knows his political savvy. He knows what's going on here. We talked about he knows that they're doing it because of envy, for he knew, verse 10, for he knew it was because of envy that the chief priest had handed him over. Pilate knows exactly what's going on here. Pilate has the chance to be a stand-up guy here. But like a lot of politicians in that day and that day, today, he's looking more in retaining his position and keeping the peace. He has the chance. He has the power. Pilate can end this. He can say, nope, we're releasing Barabbas, we're releasing Jesus, and it's done. But he doesn't. He doesn't. He just lets it ride. Let's go on to beginning of verse 21. He turns him over. He lets it go. He has Jesus flogged. And then he hands him over to the soldiers to be crucified. They led him out to crucify him. They forced a man coming in from the country who was passing by to carry Jesus' cross. He was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. They tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Then they crucified him and divided his clothes. casting lots for them to decide what each would get. Now it was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge written against him was King of the Jews. They crucified 2 criminals with him, one on the right and one on his left. Those who passed by were yelling insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "Ha, the one who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself by coming down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests and the scribes were mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross so that we may see and believe." Even those who were crucified with him taunted him. So now we're in the actual crucifixion. In the section right before this, the last verse talked about they flogged him. You know what flogging is like? Oftentimes what happened in a flogging is someone did not survive the flogging to be crucified. A whip, embedded bits of bone and metal that when it was brought down across someone's back, when it was pulled back, would pull off pieces of flesh. Flogging was a brutal, brutal thing. So Jesus, before they take him out to be crucified, he's flogged. Interesting note in verse 21, Mark records the children of Simon as Alexander and Rufus in this section. Why do you think they're mentioned? Because Simon is the one who's, pulled into service to carry the cross. Why do you think we mentioned Alexander and Rufus here? A lot of folks think that their names are mentioned there because they likely were or became Christians. And the audience reading this would know who they were. So he's pointing out these people over here, it was their dad who was forced to carry the cross. But a lot of commentators believe that's why the names are even mentioned there, because it's the only mention of them. It talks about offering wine. Sometimes the wine was offered in mercy. Some believe here the soldiers are offering it as part of the mockery that's going on. The whole process, the sham of a trial, and now the mockery that's going on. And it's really, to me, it seems sort of odd that the Romans would offer this to someone in mercy because they were not a merciful people when they were going to kill someone. Then, in verse 24, then they crucified him. We talked a couple of weeks ago, or last week when we were talking about Jesus praying in the garden. Crucifixion was such a horrible way to go. Romans didn't even talk about it. They didn't talk about it. And we are right out of time. We will pick up there next week from the crucifixion.